Hello and welcome. Well, I've got a very, very special guest with me today. We're at Edge Hill University, which is a very progressive, forward-thinking university doing some amazing work. And I'm here with Professor Rod Nicolson. You were tempted here not that long ago. This is clearly must be a very exciting move for you.
Yes, I only moved here about a year ago, having had many years in Sheffield. But I just thought it was time for a change. I felt that the opportunities for doing some really interesting stuff here were slightly higher than in most other parts of academia.
Yeah. So Professor Nicolson, he's been working on many things, but particularly focused on dyslexia. He's a passion for helping understand why it is that children struggle. He put out some very radical thoughts about 20 years ago, based upon very good science, I would add. And so he's been very involved at the highest level in understanding children, and he's been my mentor for the last 20 years. So I'm so thrilled to be able to introduce Professor Nicolson to you, and to all those thousands of children around the world who have benefited from the work that I've been doing. This is the person you must thank, because he is my mentor, my steerer. He gave me all of the initial ideas of where to look in the brain to find out why these otherwise bright children were struggling with everyday issues. So how long has your interest in dyslexia and reading issues been?
Really, I've been interested in dyslexia for probably 35 years, but my first work in it was when I started working with my PhD student, Angela Fawcett, on dyslexia 30 years ago, because she has a dyslexic husband and a dyslexic son.
Wow.
And she said to me, having done our degree in Sheffield at that time, can you help me understand what the cause of dyslexia is? And we were lucky enough to actually have a breakthrough pretty quickly. Yeah. And from there it developed and developed and developed and took over quite a lot of my life.
So tell us just what that breakthrough was, because you went in the opposite direction to many other researchers in the field. Just summarise what that was.
I hadn't deliberately gone in an opposite direction. No. It's not that I'm particularly awkward.
You're not contrarian.
Well, I mean, sometimes you make more progress by doing things that other people aren't doing, which is actually what I always thought was a useful thing to do. And the thing which I thought that people weren't doing in the dyslexia world at that time, which is in the late 1980s, was that they weren't looking at dyslexia as a learning issue, which just seemed to me completely baffling, because obviously...
What were they looking at it as?
Well, they were looking at it as a reading problem, or a memory problem, or a vision problem, or an auditory problem, but they weren't looking deeper within the brain as to why the kids were having these problems. Yeah. And as it happens, my area is learning, and naturally I therefore started looking at... I said, why don't we look at learning as dyslexia as a learning problem? Yeah. And the breakthrough I think that we got was that, in a sense, one of the obvious suggestions for why it might be a learning problem is that for some reason dyslexic kids don't get really expert in a skill despite practicing. So whenever I talk to...
So you mean they can work hard at practicing, but they don't develop the expertise that others would in the same amount of time?
Exactly. So when I'm talking to the students, I always talk about learning to drive, because we all, so long ago that we learned to walk and to talk. Yeah. But learning to drive, everyone knows what not being expert at driving is. You can actually drive, but you have to concentrate fully the whole time, and if anything goes wrong, you go to pieces. Yeah. Another year's worth of driving, you're automatic, it all works fine, you can talk and do lots of other things at the same time. So that's automaticity. In a sense, somehow you've downloaded that skill from having to think about it to it just being automatically done by some lower level skills in the brain. Yeah. Similarly with reading, of course. Yeah. People who are expert at reading can read really effectively, don't know how to do it. Yeah, they
don't have to think about it.
Don't have to think about it. But of course, we don't think, reading isn't an innate skill. It's not as though humans were designed to read. Reading is a learned skill. Yeah. And so the processes of learning to read are pretty much the same processes as learning to do anything else. And so we put forward the hypothesis that for some reason, and this is about 1990, dyslexic kids have problems making skills automatic. And it's such a good explanation. It captures almost everything the dyslexic kids have difficulties with. It's just that lack of automaticity. They can do it, but they have to try harder, and therefore they're more tired by the end of the day. It's like for me driving in France.
Yeah.
You know, you can do it, but you have to work harder if they're all on the wrong side of the road, etc., etc. You're putting in a lot more conscious effort, and so you're shattered and things go wrong.
So my observation is, I'd like your take on this, is that many of the children, in fact virtually all of the children that struggle with reading actually are not low intelligence necessarily. This is a skill which is a very different thing to the degree of underlying intelligence.
Well, intelligence is a bit of a slippery concept, to be fair.
Oh, is it?
I mean, often intelligence is doing well on the sort of tests that you get in IQ tests, and they tend to test what's called declarative knowledge. That is, knowledge of vocabulary, knowledge of the world, but not skills.
So it's things you have learned and can recall.
It's things that you have learned, and typically we find, especially with high-performing dyslexic kids, they're really, really good at that knowledge, that declarative skill. But what they're not so good at is at the doing things skills, the automaticity skills. And that's, in a sense, that would be how I would characterise it. These kids are often very, very good at the knowledge, and therefore will do quite well on most aspects of an IQ test. Classically, the problem for IQ tests is working memory, speed of processing. Those are the problems that the dyslexic kids have, but on knowledge and many other parts of IQ, those kids will be terrific.
Well, you've been saying this sort of thing since 1990. You've
Yes.
put all sorts of research out.
Yes.
We're a generation on from there, and what was quite thrilling for me, although quite sad in some ways, some research came out of Carnegie Mellon, a very famous university in America, specifically mentioning you and your work and saying what you were doing many years ago is really good science.
Yes.
How does that make you feel?
Well, every few years people come along, and because obviously, as you know, we then moved on from saying what the problem is automaticity to deeper in the brain, what's causing that, and we said it's the cerebellum, which is the major cause of
Where is that? That's here?
That's I should have brought my brain model along. But yes, it's at the back of the brain, known as the little brain, the hind brain, and it's all vertebrates have it, and it's actually there for coordinating their movements.
Yeah.
But what turned out, what we found out in the 1990s from the early brain imaging studies, is that cerebellum is also involved, not just in movements, but also in mental movements, that is, speech and thought.
So all coordination?
Coordination of everything, and indeed, nowadays, the coordination of emotions as well. Coordination of perception, you know, your hearing, your sight, your motions, your thought. The cerebellum is a key structure.
I remember you telling me right the first time we met about the cerebellum, and I said, what is it, where is it? So I've now learned that much, but still we've got so much to learn about it. But what I now know is it's only 10% in terms of volume, but it's more than 50% in terms of number of brain cells in the whole of the brain. So it's incredibly important. Why is it that everybody isn't talking about the cerebellum and how you can change it and transform it to overcome these issues? It seems to be far more important than it's getting. Somebody described it as the Rodney Dangerfield of the brain.
Well, I think basically the cerebellum is the structure that has allowed vertebrates to really thrive, because all of the vertebrate movements, you know, that crawling stuff, that's coordinated to the cerebellum, and anything to do with rhythm is coordinated to the cerebellum. And to be honest, it's been overlooked. It's never been the sexy part of the brain from the research perspective until brain imaging came in. And so all the early research on the cerebellum showed that it was motor skills, which has never been so much valued. Yeah.
And you know, if you've got a child that's struggling with any form of learning issue, be it reading, writing, concentrating, or social skill development, or even sporting, movement development, the cerebellum is probably the root cause. And does that give us hope, or does it destine these children to be like that the rest of their lives?
Oh, well, yes. There's sort of 2 points there. So, is the cerebellum like to be involved? The cerebellum is, in a sense, at the heart of most of the circuitry involved in the brain. So, the frontal lobes are connected to the cerebellum, the whole rest of the brain is connected to the cerebellum, your body is connected to the cerebellum. So, the cerebellum is at the heart of all of these things. The other part was, can you do anything about it? The cerebellum is one of the key structures for making skills automatic.
Yeah.
If you've made skills automatic, but not very good, like my typing, then...
Or my dancing.
Or my dancing and your dancing. Then it's actually very difficult to unlearn those skills. That's the hardest thing in the world.
Right.
And therefore, what tends to happen is that as you get older, you get more and more sort of habit-bound. And if you've got some habits which don't work that way, it's actually very hard to unlearn them.
Yeah.
And therefore you need something quite out of the ordinary to be able to unlearn them.
So what you've taught me is that if you can force the cerebellum by stimulating it so it starts to do things in a different way, the cerebellum itself will start to develop, and the ability of the brain to acquire new skills starts to increase and improve, and you have a really good chance of overcoming those things that have been limitations. So if you look at children who have got limitations, maybe they've been labelled, maybe they haven't been labelled, but if there's things holding them back in their learning, it's because of skills not fully developed. So we're not seeing the real child, we're not seeing the real child's intelligence, we're seeing the limitations that they have. And that's the thrilling bit about what Professor Nicolson has brought to the scientific world in our understanding of the cerebellum, is that it is now possible to understand and find where the root cause is, and it is now possible to come up with ways of stimulating the cerebellum so the brain's fundamental ability to acquire new skills is affected. Is that a fair summary?
Well, I think probably in 10 years' time the case will be really strongly made.
Yeah.
This is the great hope.
Yeah.
That it is possible. I mean, everyone knows that the brain responds pretty well to not succeeding at things. That's how that small child learns to crawl, to talk, to walk, and therefore, in a sense, the challenge is to challenge the brain. So it's not. So the old habits are clearly not working to it, and therefore it's forcing it to do something differently. The danger is that it can't do it, and then everyone gets the brain gets put off by that.
Yeah.
But if you can actually get it so that you can rejoin old circuits together, then that's to my mind the way that you can move forward. You can get away from being stuck under that glass ceiling to break through to the next level. Yeah. And that, to my mind, is the challenge for psychology for the next 10 years, to find the best ways of doing this. Because none of us are perfect. For the future, people who succeed in the 21st century are going to have to be less automatic. They're going to have to be more flexible. They're going to have to reinvent their jobs every few years. It's that flexibility that we need to design into any learning programs. And I would think that anyone doing professional development in the adult period will be doing something which is actually making their brains more flexible rather than less flexible. So,
you know, what you've just said in the last few minutes embodies so much. So we started off talking about reading, you quickly went on to talk about emotions, and you're talking about movement. Now you're talking about really mental flexibility and the ability to carry on learning and adapting. Cerebellum is critical to all of these things. Now, since you did your research, that's a full generation ago. We're going back nearly 30 years when you started. You don't look old enough, but you are. And that amazing research has been overlooked by many who could have been influential. And, you know, if you're a mum, I'm a dad of a daughter that was struggling badly. My own daughter didn't benefit from Professor Nicholson's work until she was 27. So she lost out much of her schooling. And so it's 25 years since he started putting this out there. You know, how are we going to put together an army that says, we're going to look at this, we're going to say this is real hope, because what's out there at the moment is not doing anything like enough good. It's not solving the root cause, whether it's emotional problems or reading problems or concentration problems or behavioural problems or movement and balance or social skill development. Too many children have got one or more of these limitations, and the researchers out there, where it focused on, could come up with some amazing results for these children.
I think there's been some excellent work done in each one of these particular areas. There's been excellent work done on reading, excellent work done on emotional development, excellent work done in all sorts of areas, but nobody's getting the big picture. They're not looking underneath to the same thing which actually could actually apply to all of those things. And to my mind, that is brain plasticity and learning. and how we can actually, even in adults, increase that brain plasticity so that people can learn more.
So what you're saying is, I think, if I'm getting it right, is that too much emphasis has been put upon coping and understanding the symptoms rather than looking at the root cause and dealing with the root cause. Because often the one root cause can be the common denominator to a number of symptoms that these children have. But if you try and deal with just reading, when actually they've also got an organisation problem, and maybe they've got low self-esteem, and maybe they've got a few other things, maybe their handwriting is poor and they hold their pen strangely. If they've got a number of symptoms, if you pick them off one at a time, it's hard work. But what you're saying is the root cause is very often the cerebellum, and it explains so many of these things.
Yes, in a sense, it's the curse of scientific specialism.
Yeah.
If you need to get to the frontiers, you need to specialise. Yeah. By definition, specialisers mean that you don't look round the sides to see what there is.
Yeah.
And therefore, that's what's happened. We're in a whole series of silos which don't talk to each other.
Yeah.
If we could look underneath those silos, what are the underlying factors? That would make an enormous difference.
Yeah.
And to my mind, that's the way forward. And indeed, for the dyslexia research, I'm a bit of a slow learner, so it took me 30 years to realise all I've been looking at was weaknesses.
Yeah.
And to be honest, I don't like people saying what my weaknesses are, forcing me to work to my weaknesses.
But Professor Nicholson's published a book called
Positive Dyslexia. I should have brought that along.
You should. He didn't bring his book, he didn't bring his brain, not his own brain, he's got that, but he's got a lovely plastic brain. So where can they get this book, Positive Dyslexia?
Well, the Positive Dyslexia book, the gist is that rather than trying to find the weaknesses and beating oneself up about the weaknesses, you should try to find your strengths and try to develop your strengths, because that makes it a pull goal rather than a push goal. No one likes being pushed, especially not adults. There's lots of evidence that some dyslexic adults have enormous skills of creativity and innovation. I think that we need to rebrand dyslexia to highlight the skills. We need to make sure that all organisations actually have a good proportion of dyslexic workers, because they're the ones who are going to actually help those organisations rather than be a hindrance. The book itself, Positive Dyslexia, sort of develops the underlying theory. It applies it to a whole range of areas, and it also brings in the emotional difficulties that are caused by being beaten up about not succeeding at school. And I think it was a good book. Having developed the thesis that dyslexic people, for a dyslexic person, a book is like a spider. It's a phobic stimulus. It doesn't make much sense.
Can I buy the book?
It doesn't make so much sense to just make the book buyable.
Oh, okay.
But I did. I did publish it on Amazon, and you can buy it.
Oh, you can publish it. You can buy it on Amazon. Professor Rod Nicholson, Positive Dyslexia. So this is the amazing brain who has helped us understand our brains far more and has given me hope. He saved my daughter's life, so you can imagine how much I respect him. But his work hasn't reached the millions that are still struggling with all sorts of skill limitations. Professor Nicholson has given us the clues, given us all sorts of tips and ideas. We need a lot more academics. We need a lot more from the educational world to look hard at what he is doing, because what has been popular for the last few decades has not improved the statistics about how many children suffer. Now, as parents, we're not actually interested in statistics. We're interested in my child and your child. So I want you to take away great hope. Professor Nicholson has given me a lot of pointers which enabled me to develop with my team the programs that are transforming lives. This is the person to thank. And so if you've got any questions, I will get back to you later, and I will get them get answers to them as quickly as I can. We've just discovered, very topical, we've just discovered the Conservative Party conference on it in England, and the Minister of Health has just announced that he's dyslexic, and what do we know about him? We know he's very bright, he's got to a very high position, but he's got some limitations. Now, some people confuse dyslexia, that dyslexia has given them some magical ability. No, it's the other way around. Their brain has given them some magical ability. Dyslexia has actually been a limitation. We could actually get rid of his limitation and leave him with all his brilliance, but without the handicap of finding reading very, very hard work. So we might even be talking to the Minister of Health very soon, and I'd like to introduce him to you so you can tell him what you knew 25 or 30 years ago that could have changed even his life.
Excellent.
Thank you for watching, thank you for listening, thank you Professor Nicolson for all your amazing work for saving the life of my daughter and helping tens of thousands of others. We now want to take your work to millions.
It's a very exciting time.
It is. So any of you mums and dads out there, we need warrior mums and warrior dads to help spread this word. Speak to you soon and I will get to your questions, and thank you for all your messages. All the best.